Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do.
We've been diving into some really fascinating source material that looks closely at how communities actually function. And honestly, it challenges some traditional ideas about how we try to connect with people outside our own circles.
What's fascinating here is precisely that challenge. This source, it pushes back on what might be conventional wisdom
Right.
by really analyzing group dynamics, how people naturally gather, and then exploring the so what for anyone hoping to engage meaningfully within those structures.
It really does. The material gets right into this idea of social silos,
Yeah.
those organic groups that form. And it contrasts traditional, what it calls extraction methods of reaching people with alternative strategies, ones deeply rooted in community and relationship building.
So our mission in this deep dive is to explore that contrast presented in the source.
Okay.
We'll look at its definition of these silos, understand its sharp critique of those traditional approaches.
Yeah, it doesn't hold back.
No, it doesn't. And then unpack its argument for these community-focused strategies like gospel planting and service, all drawn directly from the source material, of course.
So let's start there. The source introduces this concept of silos. How does it define them, and how does it say they work?
Well, the authors define silos as basically like-minded groups that naturally emerge within a larger space where people gather.
Okay, like a city, maybe? Or a campus?
Exactly. A city, a university campus, a club, even just a neighborhood. They're distinct segments, but, and this is important, the material notes they aren't impermeable.
So there's input and output. People move between them.
Right. There's flow. It's not like they're sealed off entirely.
Okay, so it's not just a mass of individuals then. There are identifiable patterns and groups within that mass.
Right. And they form along various lines, race, socioeconomic status, shared interests or affinities.
Hobbies, things like that.
Yeah, affinity groups. And families are also considered foundational microsilos in this view.
And they can definitely overlap, which makes sense. You might be part of your family, your work team, and a running club.
Precisely. And a key point the source makes is that truly identifying these patterns, understanding how these groups gather and function, well, it isn't a quick task.
It takes effort.
It requires spending significant time observing people within a space to see how the patterns actually emerge, not just, assuming you know them based on demographics or something.
That need for deep observation seems crucial, especially when the source then pivots to critique traditional approaches. It uses this term, extraction evangelism. What does that look like in the source's view?
Extraction evangelism. It's described as an approach where the focus is primarily on an outside leader, maybe a pastor, an evangelist, a missionary.
Someone coming in from outside the group.
Right, coming in and sharing their message with individuals, often with little or no kind of serious consideration for that individual's existing community or silo.
So the main aim is individual conversion, almost regardless of the person's social ties.
Yes, that's the priority highlighted in the source. The goal is individual conversion, seen as more important than discipling the whole silo or community. The material mentions that sometimes contextualization is used, adapting the message.
Sure.
But even then, it argues it's often just to make it easier for an individual within a silo to convert and leave, not to reach the whole group.
And the source doesn't pull any punches in its critique of this. What are its main arguments against it?
Well, it argues pretty strongly that this method stems from poor theology or maybe just an evangelism strategy that either doesn't understand these silo structures or chooses to ignore them.
Interesting.
And while individual faith is obviously foundational, the authors point out that individual conversions outside the immediate family or community context, they're actually presented as relatively rare in Scripture.
It mentions examples like Saul, right?
Yeah.
The Ethiopian eunuch, as being exceptions rather than the rule.
Exactly. Those are often highlighted because they're unusual. It contrasts that with the more common biblical narrative you see in Acts.
Like households.
Yeah, where households or families come to faith and are baptized together. Think of Cornelius, the Philippian jailer, Lydia.
Right.
There's a strong emphasis on the household or the community unit in that biblical pattern. And the Great Commission itself talks about making disciples of all nations, right? Which kind of implies a focus beyond just isolated individuals.
And the source argues that traditional church planting often operates under this extraction model, doesn't it?
It does.
It tends to pull people out of their existing silos to form a new silo, which is the church itself.
That's a major point the source makes. And it says, extraction, discipleship follows suit. You have unrelated people converting.
One here, one there.
Exactly. They're pulled out of their old groups, brought into a new church, expected to learn its specific culture, maybe even a new spiritual language or way of speaking.
Okay.
And then they're often expected to bring others into this new structure, but only if those outsiders are willing to leave their old ties behind too.
Which, according to the source, deeply alienates these new believers from their original communities and families.
Precisely. It makes it incredibly difficult, the source argues, for them to effectively reach their families, their communities, their nations.
How so?
Well, families often feel as though their loved ones have been stolen or kidnapped. That's strong language, but it reflects the perception.
Almost like joining a cult, from their perspective.
That's the analogy used sometimes, yeah. The original silos become suspicious of anyone who appears to abandon their cultural roots and community ties for this new thing.
And the consequence, then, is that these churches struggle to reproduce effectively. They stay small or rely on outside help.
That's the argument. They can become dependent on outside evangelists or missionaries to keep bringing new individuals in, just perpetuating the same limiting results instead of organic internal growth.
And the source notes broader negative impacts, too.
Yes, like fractured families, communities torn apart, and sometimes even leading to significant opposition or hostile legislation from governments who see this approach as socially destructive.
There's a really powerful claim the source makes here, suggesting that this extraction methodology actually plays into a negative force's hand, a spiritual dimension.
It argues that, essentially, ignoring these natural silo structures in evangelism leads to a strategy where you might gain one person.
A win, seemingly.
A seeming win, yes, but you effectively lose the opportunity to reach the rest of the family, the community, the entire silo. The source contends that many well-meaning efforts fall into this trap. They feel successful winning an individual while missing the much larger picture of reaching the whole group.
It even proposes that these techniques can inoculate people against the gospel message in the long run, make them more resistant later.
That's part of the critique. And it highlights this extraction approach as being perhaps deeply ingrained in Western Christian culture specifically.
So the argument is clear. If the goal is disciple-making movements, these DMMs that multiply exponentially,
Right.
then extraction evangelism creates too many counterproductive barriers. It needs to be replaced by a fundamentally different disciple-making mindset.
That's the core argument, yes.
If extracting individuals is the problem, what's the alternative model the source presents? It talks about disciple-making thinking and gospel planting.
This is the essential shift. Instead of viewing individuals primarily as targets for extraction, the perspective changes.
How so?
You start seeing individuals as potential doorways to families. Families become gateways to silos, and silos are seen as highways to nations.
Doorways, gateways, highways.
Okay. The strategy intentionally aims to include the person's family, community, and broader silo right from the outset, rather than isolating them.
And the source makes a strong case that the minimum unit for disciple-making shouldn't be the individual,
Correct.
but the household, the affinity group, or the community itself.
That's a core principle laid out in the material. The goal is for the group within the community to win their community. The community then wins the silo, and the silo wins the nation.
It's a ripple effect, starting from within.
Exactly. This approach is seen as working against that negative force we discussed earlier, the one that benefits from division, rather than playing into it.
So the role of the disciple maker isn't just about adding up individual converts,
Not at all.
but seeking to reach all the lost within these natural community structures.
Exactly. And crucially, to avoid any methods or strategies that actually cause people to be lost or that fracture families and communities, making future engagement harder.
So the aim is broader.
The aim is to see communities redeemed for Christ, transformed from within, not just to recruit a few people into a specific church structure or, a particular cultural expression of faith.
Okay, this sounds like a fundamentally different paradigm. It makes sense conceptually. But practically speaking, how does this community-focused approach get implemented according to the source? It mentions contagious disciple makers and discovery groups.
Right. So a contagious disciple maker in this context is someone whose primary focus isn't on being the prominent figure, the main teacher, or the front person.
Not the star of the show.
Not the star, no. Their focus is on planting the gospel within each silo. They facilitate and empower families or affinity groups within a silo to form what are called discovery groups.
Discovery groups. And what do these groups actually do?
Well, they meet together, often very simply, maybe within the group members' homes or other natural gathering
Or
places.
necessarily a church building.
Not necessarily at all. And they read God's word together and discover God's truth together, often guided by some simple, reproducible questions like, what does this passage say? What does it mean? How will we obey it? Who will we share it with?
So it's very participatory.
Very. And the activities emphasize not just learning information, but immediately putting it into practice.
Okay.
So encouraging actual disciple making, obedience to what they read, engaging in ministry together, and developing leadership from within the group itself.
And a crucial part of this model is replication, right? Multiplication. How does the source describe these groups multiplying?
Absolutely. Multiplication is key. That's the engine of a movement. Discovery groups replicate within silos as more people in that community come to faith and start their own groups.
Okay, that makes sense. Within the silo.
But they also replicate between silos by leveraging the natural existing relationships that members already have across those silo boundaries. Someone in a group knows someone in a different neighborhood or a different workplace.
And they share what they're learning.
Exactly. And potentially start a new discovery group there.
Now, this is where it seems really distinct from traditional models. The source says these groups, even after people come to faith and are baptized, they continue to meet as a family or affinity group within their existing silo. They aren't immediately expected to leave their community and attend a separate church service in a different location.
That's highlighted as a critical difference, yes.
Yeah.
The source sees these groups meeting right there within their existing silo as communities of believers, as churches, essentially.
So the church is the group meeting in its natural context.
That's the idea. They grow and reproduce right where they are, using their natural relationships to start new groups in other silos, rather than requiring people from other silos to leave their communities to come and join them for a new church experience.
That's a really significant shift in thinking about what church looks like in different contexts.
Mhm.
It sounds powerful, but the source also acknowledges there are specific barriers, right? Challenges to making this work effectively.
Oh, yes. It's definitely not presented as easy. It identifies several challenges. One is the personal perception of success.
What does that mean?
Well, many people, especially those used to traditional methods, measure success by things like how many people attend their meetings, how many listen to their teaching.
The numbers game.
Kind of, yeah. Catalyzing DMMs requires the disciple maker to deliberately step out of the spotlight. Success looks different.
So how is success measured in this model, according to the source?
The source suggests it's measured by indicators of multiplication. Things like the number of leaders trained by others within the movement, not just by you, the number of tribes or silos engaged, the number of groups started, and crucially replicated.
Groups starting groups.
Yes, and ultimately the number of groups that come to faith and are baptized as groups. It's entirely about multiplication through others, focusing on training leaders within the silo rather than being the central figure yourself.
That requires a different mindset, letting go of control.
A very different mindset. Another challenge is expectations, particularly from partners, supporters, or traditional institutions who might be expecting those traditional church growth metrics, buildings, budgets, attendance numbers.
Right. They want to see the familiar signs of success.
Exactly. So disciple makers often need to take time to educate their partners on the DMM vision and the process. It might take time before that exponential growth becomes obvious on a spreadsheet. Aligning those expectations is vital for long-term support and avoiding misunderstandings.
And identifying the silos themselves can be a barrier early on, right? That observation piece we talked about.
Yes, identification. Mapping all the different silos in a community, understanding their nuances, figuring out the best points of entry. It takes time and effort.
It's daunting.
It can be, but the source is encouraging here. It notes you don't need a complete perfect map before you start engaging. Silo mapping is an ongoing process as you get involved and learn more.
Okay. And finally, there are the firsts. What are those?
First just refers to the reality that making disciples in a new silo, one where there's no existing Christian witness for the very first time, it can simply take a while.
Patience is needed.
A lot of patience, understanding that specific community's dynamics, building trust, finding the right points of connection, developing a team perhaps, training them effectively. All of that requires time and perseverance. The source encourages disciple makers not to get discouraged during this initial phase in a new community. It's part of the process.
Okay. One theme that really stands out, woven throughout the source material, is the absolute essential role of service in this whole process.
Oh, absolutely. The authors are emphatic about this. Serving the community or tribe you are trying to reach is presented as key to effective engagement and disciple making.
Not just an add-on, but Fundamental.
Fundamental. They connect this directly to Jesus' own commands and his model, healing the sick, feeding the hungry, caring for the vulnerable, and preaching the kingdom. It's integrated.
And they offer a strong critique of how, maybe in modern times, service and disciple-making efforts have sometimes been separated.
They really do. They argue that separating them cripples the overall mission. Service without presenting the gospel is called, I think the phrase was, a Band-Aid on a mortal wound.
Wow.
Meaning, you might alleviate temporary suffering, which is good, but if people never hear the life-changing message, it's ultimately incomplete from their perspective.
So the idea is that service helps build credibility. It opens doors for the gospel message.
That's precisely how the source presents it. People in the community notice how you serve, or if you serve at all. They see if you genuinely care about their well-being, not just about getting converts.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. This builds trust and earns you the right to be heard when you eventually share the deeper reasons for your hope, for your service.
The source gives some really compelling examples of this in action. Remember reading about the Texas church supporting the fire and police departments?
Yeah, a great example, leading to incredible community relationships and apparently organic church growth among those first responders and their families, people who might never have walked into a traditional church service.
And the African disciple maker who helped women haul water by providing a donkey.
Such a simple act of service, meeting a very real felt need. That led directly to questions about his motivation, discussions about God, and ultimately a family coming to Christ and a church starting. All from a donkey.
Simple, practical acts are mentioned too, like fixing broken windows or leaky roofs in the neighborhood.
Yes, the source emphasizes meeting genuine felt needs, whatever they might be in that specific context. And this can be done personally or by mobilizing others.
Like that story about recruiting other families to help a needy lady.
Yes, the powerful example of recruiting 4 other families to minister practically to a needy lady, which eventually led to her and her entire family believing. It wasn't just one person doing it all.
And the underground leader in a restricted country.
Another key example. After facing initial resistance with more direct evangelism methods, he shifted his focus entirely to meeting the felt needs of the people first, built deep relationships through service over time. And the result? Thousands of underground churches started.
So the source's point is crystal clear. Effective engagement often starts with meeting those felt needs through service. Building trust, demonstrating care.
Right. That provides the credible entry point, the demonstration of love.
But it's not finished until those you've served have had the opportunity to hear the gospel clearly and respond.
Exactly. The clear presentation of the gospel invitation is the completion of the engagement, according to this model. Service opens the door, the message walks through it.
Okay. Building on service as an entry point, the source also discusses specific strategies for entering a tribe or community as a stranger, but without immediately creating unnecessary barriers.
Yeah, this is crucial. The goal, as you said, is appropriate engagement that doesn't alienate people right from the start.
And the source specifically warns against just showing up and announcing yourself as a religious worker, a pastor, an evangelist.
It does, especially in what it calls open countries, where you technically can do that. It argues that this often immediately creates huge avoidable barriers. People put their guard up.
Why?
Suspicion, preconceived notions, maybe past negative experiences. It argues this can hinder the discovery of a person of peace.
That term again. What's a person of peace?
It's borrowed from the Gospels, someone within the community who is receptive, who welcomes you and your message, and who can actually open doors to the rest of the tribe or community. Announcing yourself too formally up front might scare that person off before you even find them.
Okay, so what is considered the most effective way to enter, according to the source?
The best way presented is getting an introduction by a member of the community you want to reach.
Someone they already know and trust.
Exactly, someone who has a good reputation within that group. And the source notes the higher their status or respect within the community, the more likely you are to be accepted as an outsider coming in with them.
But if that ideal introduction isn't possible, what are the alternative methods suggested? There are quite a few.
Yes, the source lists numerous ways to engage when you don't have that insider introduction. Things like joining existing social activities, a soccer game was mentioned.
Just blend in.
Right. Or selling needed goods or services, finding local employment, or meeting other felt needs through things like education, medical assistance, providing access to clean water, agricultural support. Lots of options.
And business comes up again here.
Yes. Engaging through legitimate business that improves the local economy is highlighted as particularly effective. And it notes that many of these methods require little upfront financial investment beyond, the cost of starting the business or having the skill.
And cultural sensitivity throughout this process is stressed as absolutely non-negotiable.
Crucially important. You absolutely have to listen to the community, understand their values, their practices before you plan any engagement activities.
Don't assume you know best.
Never. Whatever you do has to make cultural sense to them. It has to resonate with their reality, not just seem like a good idea from your own cultural perspective.
The puppy and candy example in the source really drives this point home, doesn't it?
It's such a vivid illustration of getting it wrong versus getting it right.
Remind us how it goes.
Well, a well-meaning outsider might think showing up at a park or public place with a cute puppy and offering candy is a friendly way to meet kids and, through them, their parents. It seems harmless, right?
From a certain perspective, maybe.
But the source points out that in many cultures, a strange adult approaching children like that is seen as incredibly inappropriate, even threatening. Parents would likely grab their children and leave immediately. You've created a barrier.
Okay, so that's the wrong way. What's the right way in that scenario?
The source contrasts this with bringing your own family, say, your spouse, your kids, maybe your own family puppy. Now you have a naturally accepted reason to be in that public space.
You're just another family.
Exactly. You're seen as part of a normal family unit, not a lone stranger with questionable motives. And that naturally opens the door for casual conversations with other parents, which could eventually lead to deeper relationships and maybe spiritual discussion down the line.
That example perfectly highlights the difference between an idea that makes sense to you versus an action that makes sense within the local culture.
Precisely.
Now, building on that idea of culturally appropriate engagement, the source spends significant time on using business as a specific tool.
Yes, business is presented as a remarkably powerful tool for entering communities, for engaging people, for identifying those potential persons of peace.
And the authors argue that legitimate, for-profit businesses can often be more effective than nonprofit models in certain contexts. Why is that?
Well, the reasoning is that people everywhere understand legitimate business. It makes cultural sense, it makes economic sense in almost any setting.
It's a universal language, almost.
In a way, yes. Nonprofits, while incredibly valuable, can sometimes be viewed with suspicion. Where does the money come from? What's the real agenda? Or simply misunderstood, especially across cultural divides. Business engagement is often seen as a more natural, understandable, and sustainable interaction. And if you're providing a real service or product people want, it makes sense.
The story about the walled village is such a compelling illustration of this. Can you walk us through that one again?
It is a fantastic example. So this disciple maker, they initially faced a literal physical barrier. They couldn't just walk into this isolated walled village. Security, suspicion, who knows?
So they observed.
They observed, and they noticed the women had to travel a really long distance just to get to the nearest market to buy basic goods.
A clear felt need.
A very clear felt need. That observation sparked an idea to bring the market to them. So he started setting up shop, just selling needed goods right outside the village gate.
Patiently.
Very patiently. Over months, consistently being there, providing value, being reliable. He built trust. He became, as the source says, well-known and liked by everyone, including the guards at the gate.
And the breakthrough came because of that built trust, right? It wasn't just about the selling.
Exactly. The trust was key. An older woman inside the village placed a large special order, 50 kilos of rice, I think it was, a big amount.
Too much to carry easily.
Right. And because he had patiently built this reputation of trustworthiness over time, the guards, who knew him and liked him by now, allowed him to bring the large delivery inside the village gate.
The door opened.
Literally. This act of service, facilitated by his legitimate business, opened the door to the village. He was then invited into village life, eventually found that receptive person of peace, and started a discovery group, a church, inside that previously inaccessible village.
That story powerfully illustrates the patience needed and the culturally relevant nature of using business in this way. It wasn't forced.
Not at all. And the source lays out some key principles for using business effectively in this kind of context.
What are those?
It has to be genuinely legitimate, no shady operations. It must provide real value to the community. And crucially, it must make a profit.
Make a profit. That seems counterintuitive sometimes in ministry contexts.
The source is very clear on this. If the business can't be profitable and sustainable on its own terms, don't do it, because then it's not seen as a legitimate business, it's seen as a handout or something else, and it loses its cultural power. Profitability demonstrates legitimacy and sustainability.
That makes sense.
And the final principle mentioned is, if you lack business experience yourself, partner with someone who does, so they can run the business side competently, allowing you to focus on the relationship building and disciple-making objectives. Play to your strengths.
The authors also mention their own diverse activities and interests as examples, don't they? Things beyond formal ministry or business.
They do. Things like fly fishing, running endurance races, studying martial arts, doing disaster relief work, starting a LAN cafe for gamers, being EMT certified, a whole range of things.
How does that connect?
Their point is that these hobbies, skills, and jobs create organic opportunities to connect with people in their natural environments, people who would likely never come to a traditional church event.
Meet people where they are.
Exactly. These interactions start as casual conversations around a shared interest that can deepen into meaningful relationships and often, quite naturally, lead to spiritual discussions because you've built that trust and connection first. It's about integrating engagement into everyday life and leveraging whatever unique skills or interests you possess.
So pulling all of this together then,
Yeah.
we've really explored the source's perspective here. It gives us a clear framework for understanding these community silos. And makes a strong case for moving beyond an individualistic extraction model towards a much more community-focused gospel-planting approach.
And the source highlights that this is best achieved through genuine service and culturally appropriate engagement strategies that work within existing communities and relationships, rather than attempting to pull people out of them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this perspective strongly emphasizes the value of integration, doesn't it?
I think so, yes. Integrating our faith authentically into our daily lives, integrating acts of service with our efforts to share the gospel, and taking the time to truly understand communities from the inside out before we try to engage.
It's holistic.
It is. And the source's argument is compelling. These approaches, the ones focusing on the household and community unit, are presented as not only potentially more effective for fostering widespread multiplying impact, but also potentially more aligned with the biblical patterns we see throughout Scripture, working with the grain of how God seems to have designed human community.
Well, this definitely raises an important question for all of us, I think. Considering how deeply connected people really are within their communities, their families, their affinity groups, what existing relationships or community needs right around you might be the natural starting point for exploring a different kind of engagement. Something to mull over.